Welcome to North Branch Nature Center's Amphibian Road Crossing Program online volunteer training. This is part 2, discussing amphibian ecology. We'll talk a lot about the life histories of amphibians that you will find doing surveys here in the Northeast. We're going to talk about 3 major points in the lives of these amphibians, what their lives are like for most of the year, their amazing migration, and also their breeding season. And we're going to focus on 3 characters throughout this. We're going to talk about spotted salamanders first. These are the largest salamanders you're likely to find on our survey, and perhaps the most charismatic. They spend most of the year underground, living in rodent burrows and root channels, and they really only come out at night where they're looking for bugs and worms and slugs and other things to eat. They're found on or underneath the forest floor, and to find them most of the year you really have to look under logs and rocks. And like all amphibians, they have to stay moist, so they really need to keep their skin wet. And here's an example of a spotted salamander trying to get underneath some leaves for cover. Wood frog is the second character in our story. Again, mostly nocturnal, but this is one you're more likely to see hopping around the forest floor during the day. And they're found kind of in our shadier forests, in deciduous forests where there are lots of dropped leaves, which they blend in really well to. They're quite cryptic. You can see in that top right photo just how well they blend in with the leaves on the forest floor. And there's a pair of wood frogs on the bottom there. You can see a difference in size between the female on the bottom and the male on the top. And during the breeding season, those females can look like almost reddish pink color, while the males stay a more brown or gray. The third character in our story is the four-toed salamander. This is probably the smallest salamander you are likely to find on our surveys, and I think the most strikingly patterned. They really have this beautiful brown and scallop pattern back with this white belly with big black speckles. Again, nocturnal and really rare outside of the Champlain Valley and the lower Connecticut River Valley. This is a specialist of forested wetlands and floodplains. They really love those low, wet, wooded places. And like many of our small, slender salamanders, they have an amazing adaptation to avoid predators. What they'll do is, if they're stressed or being attacked by a predator, they can actually drop their tail. Their tail comes off of the rest of their body, and their tail can actually wriggle around on its own and looks very much like a worm, allowing the salamander to get away while the predator is distracted or grabbing the tail for a snack instead. And that tail will grow back eventually. It takes a lot of time and energy for the salamander, so it's not something that the salamander really wants to do or is good for it, but it does allow the salamander to survive. So when we're crossing these salamanders, as well as redback salamanders, which have the same adaptation, we want to make sure we're not picking them up by their tail. We're being very careful not to do that to them. Sometimes at crossing sites, you'll see four-toed salamanders or redback salamanders that have a little stubby tail, and that's probably where in the past their tail came off, and they're starting to regrow that. So here's another example of where this four-toed salamander is living in these really damp, low wetlands. Anywhere you find these kind of lower floodplains and river valleys with this big fern undergrowth and maybe some trees and other things that are fallen down. It's a tough life to be an amphibian, though. There are lots of things that would love an amphibian snack. So garter snakes and other snakes love to eat amphibians. Raccoons, possums, owls, shrews, and other amphibians. Bullfrogs will eat smaller frogs like wood frogs or salamanders. Oftentimes at road crossing sites, you may encounter these. I often see skunks or possums or raccoons that are looking for amphibians crossing the road. It's a really easy place for them to grab a snack when there's lots of prey crossing. Winter is perhaps the most challenging time for these amphibians, and there's a few different ways that they survive the winter. So spotted salamanders and four-toed salamanders both spend the winter underground. Spotted salamanders are going way down underground underneath the frost line using these rodent tunnels. And they're still pretty active throughout the winter, eating worms and other invertebrates that are down there. Four-toed salamanders are also going underground. They may use things like rock crevices that protrude way underground to get down below the frost line. And wood frogs, as well as spring peepers, have a really fascinating adaptation. They don't try and escape the winter. They sort of succumb to it for a period of time. They have special sugars and proteins that their body creates in the late fall to prepare. And what happens when it frosts is their cells actually begin to freeze. But those sugars and proteins allow them to freeze in a very specific way, so that while they'll spend the winter solid, sort of in a frogsicle, and their heart and their lungs will slow to a standstill, their cells are protected. They are in a state of suspended animation all winter long, and when spring comes and it begins to warm, they'll actually unthaw, and their heart and lungs will come back to full function, and their cells will unthaw, but those special sugars and proteins allow that to happen and not rupture their organs or cells. It's a pretty amazing feat. We're just coming into the time of migration, which is pretty spectacular. These migrations are cued by a few different things. So the soil is beginning to warm up. The air temperature is beginning to warm. Our snowpack is starting to melt, and that snow is melting deeper down into the soil. And those first spring rains are a really big cue that signals these amphibians to either come out from their underground places, or in the case of wood frogs and spring peepers, to unthaw and begin to move across our landscape. These amphibians are moving quite a ways. Spotted salamanders can go more than a quarter of a mile, so that's often traversing woods, fields, and other areas to get to their place where they're breeding. Wood frogs can hop even further, more than a half a mile, to reach their pools. So that's quite a distance. It's quite a journey for an animal that's only a few inches long. One study showed that 90% of the spotted salamanders in a population, a group of spotted salamanders, return to its vernal pool over a period of 5 days. So in the span of 5 days, most of the spotted salamanders in one pool came back. So that shows that this migration can happen really quickly in one area. When the conditions are right, they all want to move at once. And those spotted salamanders are wood frogs. The males in particular, they want to be the first ones back to their breeding pool so that they can compete for the females. And so here you see a picture of a wetland area in the bottom middle of the screen. On the right, it's bordered by an upland forest that has no barrier down to the wetland. But on the left, you can see there's a forest. And in between the left forest and the wetland, there's now a road. That avenue for migration has been cut off by traffic. In this picture, you can see a more intact system where there's a wetland that's bordered by an upland forest. So those two habitats that amphibians need, that upland wintering habitat and that breeding area, that wetland, are adjacent to each other. And so next I'm going to show a slide with some amphibians that did not survive migration. And so just a warning that there'll be some perhaps unsettling photos. And this is showing the unfortunate cost of migration for some amphibians. And it's a cost that we as humans are imposing on them. And it's one thing that you may see when you're out doing road crossings. So it's an unfortunate picture, but one that you should be prepared to encounter when doing the survey. And so we've actually built a lot of barriers to amphibians migrating, mainly in the form of roads. And some studies have shown that it doesn't take a lot of mortality at any given site to lead to the loss of a population. 10% can do it over time. So that essentially means that if in a given year, 1 out of every 10 amphibians is hit by a car, over time, that population may disappear. It may take years or even decades, but as low as 1 in 10 amphibians being removed annually will lead to that population disappearing. So we have a real responsibility, since we've built these barriers, to come up with solutions to prevent that from happening. And some of the solutions can be really creative. The Harris Center in southern New Hampshire partnered with the city of Keene, where they identified a place right in the city where there was an upland forest, part of a park, that was across a busy street from a wetland where some amphibians were breeding. And so on nights where they anticipate a movement, warm, rainy spring nights, they actually close the road. They have the Public Works Department go out and put barriers on a stretch of road, and then volunteers can safely count amphibians crossing. So that's a really great partnership that has protected this population. And they do that in collaboration. They put the word out to the community so the community knows when it's going to happen. And there are also alternative roads that folks can take that don't have them driving through a peak crossing site. Another solution, the photo on the right, is showing some upgrades to transportation infrastructure. So in places where there's a substantial crossing, we can do things like oversizing culverts. If there's going to be a culvert replacement, a community can put in a bigger culvert, which may allow amphibians to pass through it, or expanding the size of a bridge to allow amphibians to go follow that path along a stream or river. Communities and the Vermont Agency of Transportation are willing to do that, but the first thing they need are data to support it, like the data that you folks are collecting. And so we make those data that are collected by our volunteers available to communities and to the Agency of Transportation so that they can plan for projects like this. And one such example, I showed this video in part 1, but I want to talk more about this project in Moncton that was spearheaded by the Moncton Conservation Commission in partnership with Vermont Agency of Transportation and the Vermont Reptile and Amphibian Atlas, where they had volunteers doing a survey similar to the survey we are now doing. And they were able to show where lots of amphibians were dying on this busy road trying to cross to a breeding site. So you can see on the top right of the photo on the left, an upland forest where amphibians are spending the winter. And on the bottom left, there's a wetland where they're breeding. After securing some grant funding, they were able to build this underpass that allows amphibians to cross safely between the two habitats. You can see there's the underpass underneath the road, and then a long section of barriers. And those barriers actually guide the amphibians toward the underpass. And at the very end of that line of barriers, there's a little turnaround piece of metal that actually turns amphibians around if they're going the wrong way and directs them back toward that underpass. And I'm playing the video again so you can just see how well that works. Those little black lines and dots are all amphibians moving safely underneath the road.
On the first warm, wet nights in spring, salamanders that have spent their year mostly underground move down into these wetlands for breeding.
It's part of their life cycle to go from the upland to the wetland to breed. They need to do that. They need these two parts of habitat. Oftentimes, those parts are bisected by roads. We're not talking about sites where there are 1 or 2 amphibians crossing the road. We're talking about sites where there are thousands of amphibians crossing the road. At these sites, 1 or 2 passing cars can have a significant impact on that population. Biologists do not believe it's a sustainable situation. There are solutions. There are ways to fix this problem, but Fish and Wildlife and VTrans need to know where these sites are.
We need your help in identifying where these zones are across the state. On these first warm, wet nights of spring, watch out for amphibian crossings and help us by reporting these amphibian crossings to the Vermont Reptile and Amphibian Atlas.
Both the Reptile and Amphibian Atlas and the Vermont Agency of Transportation are partners of ours, and we make the data that our volunteers collect available to both organizations. I'm going to move now to talk about what happens when they get to the other side of their migration, which is breeding. And oftentimes, the other side of their migration is a vernal pool. These are really special little ecosystems, small open wetlands that develop in the spring when rain and snowmelt fills depressions or small basins in the forest. Typically, they dry out by the end of the summer. Some may only dry out every other year or every few years, but it's important that they dry out completely at a regular basis and do not have a permanent inlet or outlet, because that will not sustain fish life. Some amphibians do breed in larger wetlands, and in those places that do sustain fish, fish are a primary predator for the developing amphibians. So these vernal pools are really special in that there are no fish predators for the young amphibians. And they also are really special in a diversity of life in insects and mollusks like snails and invertebrates such as fairy shrimp that support this amazing small ecosystem. And there are some sounds of a vernal pool in the spring. You can hear both wood frogs and spring peepers. Here's the progression of a vernal pool throughout the season. On the left, you'll see probably late winter or early spring, just as it's starting to warm and the sun is starting to increase, and the ice is beginning to move out on this vernal pool. Wood frogs, which are our first moving species, may arrive at the pool even in this stage while there's still snow on the ground and still some ice on the vernal pool. The next one to the right shows that the ice is progressing a little bit further. Perhaps it's rained once or twice, and the vernal pool is beginning to fill. The next to the right shows a full vernal pool sometime in early spring before leaf out, and that's really when most of the action is taking place. During this stage, a lot of the amphibians have arrived back to the vernal pool and perhaps are starting to lay their eggs, and young are starting to develop. And all the way to the right is a stage of dry down. Maybe by mid to late summer or even early fall, the vernal pool has nearly completely dried, and all the amphibians have had time to complete their life cycle, and the young amphibians have moved away from the water and out into their upland forest for the winter. It's really important that the vernal pool can extend its period throughout the summer, where the amphibians can fully develop before the vernal pool disappears. And it's really important also that the area around the vernal pool is protected. And that's often referred to as the vernal pool life zone. It's that intact forest that surrounds the vernal pool that really keeps it protected. These vernal pools can be really sensitive to nearby developments and roads. Runoff and pollution into the vernal pool can make it uninhabitable for these amphibians. And the tree canopy around the vernal pool keeps it cool and prevents the sun from drying it down prematurely before the amphibians have time to develop. And so this area around the vernal pool is just as important as the vernal pool itself to this ecosystem. It is also where many of these amphibians are going to spend the winter. And so when talking about conserving these, we're not talking about conserving just the vernal pool, but the life zone around it as well, which may be up to a quarter mile. The spotted salamanders are breeding primarily in these vernal pools. It's a fascinating courtship. And when they first arrive back to the vernal pool in the spring, the males begin this dance to compete for the females. They'll gather in this large group called a congress, and the male spotted salamanders will interweave and dance in front of the females. They'll also release pheromones to attract the females. And then the males will lay sperm packets called spermatophores down on the bottom of the pool. When a female has selected a male, the male will guide her to the sperm packet that he has laid down, and she'll pick up that sperm packet with her cloaca and use it to fertilize her eggs. Female spotted salamanders are usually laying a small cluster of around 100 eggs. Younger females are laying fewer, and older females may lay several packets of eggs. Here's a picture of what that breeding congress might look like. You can see lots of spotted salamanders. They're nudging each other with their heads. They're weaving in and out. This is what a vernal pool looks like in the spring during the breeding season. This activity is primarily happening at night. And if you came to this vernal pool during the day, you might not find a lot of activity. In fact, most of the salamanders may be underneath cover, underneath leaves in the bottom of the vernal pool, and hiding from predators. Breeding for wood frog is happening sometimes even on the way to the vernal pool. You can see that once a male has selected a female, he grabs onto her with his legs in the top right photo. This is something called amplexus. And the female on the bottom is a little bit larger. You can see she's a little reddish. When she lays her eggs, the male that is clasped onto her is going to fertilize them as they come out. And so you get this pairing of wood frogs. On the bottom, you can see that there are 3 males there fighting over a female. There are sometimes these fights where the males are competing for a female. And they're laying a mass of eggs that will sometimes have several hundred eggs in them. And it will swell to about the size of a softball in the water. And they're often laid in these groups. So you might get a raft of a dozen or more clusters of eggs. So you can have tens of thousands of wood frog eggs in one vernal pool or one wetland. The four-toed salamander does things a little bit differently. Rather than laying a cluster of eggs directly in the vernal pool, these little salamanders are finding a moist spot underneath moss that's above the vernal pool, perhaps a few feet over the vernal pool on a log that has fallen over it, or right next to a vernal pool on a rock. They're laying eggs individually, but in a small group, underneath that moss that's going to keep the eggs moist as they develop. They're going to develop for a few weeks, and then when they reach a certain stage, the young salamanders, the larval salamanders, are going to hatch out of their egg and fall from that moss down into the vernal pool, where they'll complete the rest of their development. So they really need this specific fishless wetland that has these habitat features, these logs or rocks that are covered with sphagnum moss adjacent to or over the vernal pool. I want to highlight a couple projects that you can do as well, in addition to ours, that help with vernal pool conservation. Both are run by Vermont Center for Eco Studies. The first one is the Vermont Vernal Pool Monitoring Project. In this project, citizen scientists visit vernal pools throughout their period, so late winter through spring and early summer, and they're tracking different metrics of this vernal pool, things like water temperature, water depth, the number of amphibians witnessed in the pool, and that allows VCE to keep track of the health of these vernal pools, both individually and at a larger scale. And they're able to help with conserving these vernal pools using those data. The second project is the Vermont Vernal Pool Atlas, another Vermont Center for Eco Studies project. in which they've attempted to map all of the vernal pools in the state. And so they have used some technology to predict where these vernal pools are or might be, and then volunteers go out to confirm if there's a vernal pool there. Once they are added to the database, they might be a candidate for someone to go out and monitor them as part of the vernal pool monitoring project. So if you're interested in helping conserve this really special ecosystem that we have, the vernal pool, both of these projects are great ways to extend that engagement beyond the migration season. Thank you all again for your help with this program, and we look forward to seeing you out at a road crossing this spring.